Jan, I have a surprise for you.
Oh, really? What is it?
Yes, first episode in English. Are you excited?
Oh, absolutely. I'm totally excited.
Very good, rightly so. And as you listeners know, Jan and myself have been working in pre-sales for quite some number of years now, and always one question that drives us: we want to learn how to build a world-class pre-sales team, and this is what this episode is going to be about. My name is Tim.
And I'm Jan. Together we are Sales Excellence.
This is your podcast for software B2B sales and pre-sales.
And we believe in a strategic, value-based and customer-centric sales approach.
With our knowledge and experience, we would like to help you find new inspiration and more success in your daily sales lives. Oh, this is difficult to say in English.
But you did a great job.
I managed.
As usual. So yeah, we discussed a couple of kind of issues or questions within pre-sales. So it's like we are always short on resources, and the question is how to stay scalable. And then we always would like to deliver on a very high level of quality, and this is also expected by the sales guys and the customers. And of course, we have less time in today's world to sell, actually, because customers are much better informed, right? So that was the stuff we discussed beforehand, and brought us to that question: how to build that world-class pre-sales team. And of course, we are not able to answer that question on our own, and we invited a very exciting guest for today.
So yes, we're actually very proud to announce Jon Upton here. And hi, Jon, welcome to the podcast. Glad to have you. Maybe you can give our listeners some insight of who you are and what you're doing and why your heart beats for pre-sales, of course.
Sure. Well, I'm very honored to have been invited. So thank you very much for having me. And I'm glad you guys are, trying this out in English. Good challenge for you. So yeah, my name is Jon Upton, and I'm sure you guys know, but for any of the listeners know, originally from the US, but I've been over in Europe for about 15 years now. And I am actually started off my career in consulting, working with Accenture, working on a long time ago in PeopleSoft, and then sort of after a few years joined the pre-sales world. And I have never, ever turned back. So I've basically been now 16 years in pre-sales role, working my way, followed my manager over to Siebel Systems. For those of you who may still know Siebel, if you do, we joined their consulting practice and then became an SC at Siebel, then spent a number of years at SAP working in France and across EMEA. And then about 10 years ago, joined Salesforce and took on a number of leadership positions there in the pre-sales team, or solution engineering, as we would call it there. And now, literally next week, I'm starting a new role with Oracle, where I'm going to be taking over leading their Western European pre-sales team. So I'm very, very excited. A little bit about me, I guess. Why does my heart beat for pre-sales? Honestly, I can't really think of a more exciting job. I mean, every time people ask me this, it's always like, what do you plan on doing in a couple of years? And they're kind of like, what do you really want to be doing? And I'm like, this is the greatest job on earth. Like, I can't really think about it. I mean, I can't really think of a job that's better. I love the mix between technology and sales. I love being part of a sales organization, but I love having that proximity to technology. I love being able to be out on the front line and helping customers achieve that sort of, dream of digital transformation, as well as seeing customers get value from technology, really seeing value and fixing problems that they have through technology. And I can't really think of a job that allows you to do that better. So hope
Perfect.
That answered your question.
Absolutely. And maybe just to pick up on the one point you were mentioning, Siebel, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think they were bought by Oracle at some point, right?
They were about 2 months after I left, actually. It was interesting. I remember being in my training at SAP.
Yes.
And then announced that Oracle had acquired Siebel. So that was kind of interesting too.
Okay. And now you're going, well, not really back, but you are going now
kind
to
of
Oracle.
Back. Yeah, I suppose. Yeah, exactly. So
all right.
Yeah,
Closing
very exciting. That's right.
Well,
starting a new
congratulations on the new role then.
Thank you. Very excited.
Congrats, Mr. Upton, also from my side. So it really sounds that you know how to build a world-class pre-sales team. And I know that you know it, of course. So, but before we dig into that one, general question, and it maybe sounds an easy one, like what is pre-sales, by the way, right? So short clarification. But I think it's an interesting one because you have, I would say, that multicultural background, right? So you're coming from the States, you worked in France, you worked in Germany, in Italy. So just from your perspective, for our listeners, what is pre-sales really about?
It is not doing demos. That's the one thing that I think a lot of people think is so important. I mean, it's funny because a lot of people, there's so many different definitions out there. And I think a lot of people look at it in very different ways. And it is fascinating. Sometimes you'll sit down with a salesperson and you'll very quickly understand, you look across the table and realize like, this person does not get what we do. Like you can tell in the vocabulary, in the behavior, in the requests. And I think it's so important. For me, really the definition, it's kind of what I alluded to in the first question around what is, pre-sale or pre-sales for me. It's about really demonstrating value to customers. And in my view, doesn't really have anything to do with technology. I mean, even though that's sort of the box we fall into, and my view on pre-sales is all about making sure the customer can answer that question of why would I pay money for this, or why would I implement this, or why would I do this? And that's what it's all about. And sometimes, yes, it involves technology. Sometimes it involves demonstration. Sometimes it will involve an RFP. But at the end of the day, I think our role is articulating that business value to a customer to a point where they say, I understand why I would make this decision.
Hello, yeah, I think. Well, Jan was nodding, right? For those people who can't see the video now, which is probably everyone who is listening to this. Jan was nodding. I was also nodding. So I'm very much in agreement with what you just said. So, but yeah, thanks for sharing your view on this one. Yeah. So maybe this is an opportunity to go into some more deeper details. So, I mean, obviously, building a team means obviously also hiring people, and maybe that's also dependent on where you are in your sales organization. I mean, you've been 10 years at Salesforce. Salesforce has been an organization that has seen drastic growth over the past years. And surely there's a difference in hiring for a team of 50 salespeople as opposed to hiring pre-sales for a team of 5,000 salespeople. Right. And we would love to get your view on this aspect of a pre-sales manager.
Sure. I don't think that there's not a recipe, I think, out there that's like, here's how you hire a great team. I mean, you read this, a lot of the literature and, Harvard Business Review, and it'll always be how to hire great people and how to make sure you ask the right questions. The thing with pre-sales teams, I think it's very situational. You really want to take a close look at what kind of environment are you hiring people into when you are bringing a team. By the way, there's a fantastic book out there for anybody's listening, or you guys as well, if you've read it, called The First 90 Days by, I think it's Michael Watkins. I mean, God, I hope I get his name right. Great book for anybody taking on like a new role. And it doesn't mean you just become a first-time manager. It's like any new role you're taking on. It talks about how critical that sort of the first 90 days of the role is. And he mentions how important this situational aspect is about your role. And I see it the same way when you're hiring people. If you are entering into a hyper growth situation with a team and you're ramping them up really quickly and you're hiring lots of salespeople, you want to factor that element into the profiles of the people that you are hiring. If you are inheriting a team that is performing very well, that is a very established team, that has a great relationship with sales, you might be looking for a very different profile. You might not need to necessarily find younger, more flexible, more people who are going to adapt a lot faster. You could afford to hire people who may not necessarily have that same skill set, but can more fit into more of a process. So for me, there's not a set profile. I would just say the most important thing for me has always been to look situationally at the kind of sales organization that is developing and growing, what are sort of the variables that are going to make that success? And then look at that and think, okay, how do I best support a group of individuals like this? Because you can hire a group of amazing SEs. And if I use the term SE, I mean solution engineer or pre-sales engineer. So forgive me if I do that.
Yep.
You can hire a team of SEs, of brilliant SEs, that may completely clash with a sales team because you are simply hiring them at the wrong time for that sort of business. So I think for me, that is really key. And then secondary is sort of looking at, the right sort of profiles. I hire potentially very different than a lot of other leaders do, things like emotional intelligence. And I think, maybe we may talk about that a little bit later. But for me, that situational aspect of where your business is incredibly important. I mean, you need to know whether you're going to have to account for flexibility, for lack of process, whether, you're going to have people who are going to be very entrepreneurial, or whether you can afford to bring somebody maybe a lot more process-driven, a lot more experience, and doesn't necessarily need to have those same adaptive skills. So I think that's really key.
So if I understand you correctly, you would say if you are an organization that is in strong growth, but maybe relatively small, you would rather need people that have that entrepreneurial mindset and mature that mindset, as opposed to when you have already a sales organization of 200, 300 people, where this is already a common approach. You can bring people in that maybe don't have it, but will get it once they have joined the organization.
I mean, I have seen more success with that. I think when you're in hypergrowth situations, you find people who have more of a willingness to adapt, a more flexible mindset. They aren't the kinds of people that need to be prescribed to, or need to be, process needs to be in place. You have to have people that are going to be able to go with the flow. It's really critical. Otherwise, you'll find that you may just find that people don't have that ability necessarily to react to what the market and what the customers need, and they may feel a little bit lost without the process, without the infrastructure in place essentially to make them successful in the role. It's not binary. It's not to say you have to do that. It's just, I think that's something that you need to factor in when you're hiring, and then take a look at the individuals and think to yourself, is this person in front of me with this profile going to fit into the environment that we have right now? Maybe it's a great SE, but maybe the timing right now isn't right, or the dynamic of the business that we have right now isn't right. So I'd love to give you the exact recipe and say, oh, you do A, B, C, and D, and you'll have a great SE. But I think it's important to look at that and make sure that as a leader, when you're hiring into those businesses, make sure that and you feel comfortable that dynamic is right. Or alternatively, you may say, hey, this guy's great, but he's not right for this team now. Maybe he's better in this part of the business, or maybe there's a part of the business that's very established, and maybe that's the right place for this person. So.
Got it. And to me, it sounds logical, right? So you need to look at the organization where you are in respect of business and your growth and all these things, and also does that person fit into the actual period, if you will. So if we think about hiring. What about the different kind of roles you can imagine within pre-sales? So, I mean, from my perspective, we are not talking about the one SE, right? So it's maybe more diversity within pre-sales. So, based on your experience, what are the kind of different roles you would look at if you think about hiring people for a world-class pre-sales team?
Sure. That's a very good question. And I would say kind of like C question above too. It's also really depends on where you are in your journey. I think, when you start out, much smaller organizations, you may have a much simpler, solution set. You may not necessarily see the need for a lot of different roles. You may find that it's just a question of getting people, a team built that's going to be able to act in that SE capacity, and that's okay. I think as things become, I think the key there, the key is building scale into that business, right? So basically, as your business grows, as your product set gets larger, companies maybe, as you've seen in some of the companies I've worked for, acquisitions happen. The next thing you know, you had an SE that 5 years ago was responsible for solution A, and now they're responsible for all this other crap. And it's like, oh God, okay, so how do we deal with this? And with that comes certain challenges. So, you move more from the sort of traditional SE pre-sales role who's maybe responsible for one or two products, and you have a lot of, deep knowledge there, to the point where you start to migrate into looking for things like, for example, like architect roles, people who take on a much larger view of a solution set, people who can walk into a customer and sort of talk end-to-end business processes. Even to the role of industry expertise. If I take a look at some of the, as our teams have grown and our SE organizations have grown, in my experience, you start to find a larger need for those kinds of roles to walk in and say, hey, this isn't just solution A that fits in here and addresses a specific, challenge. We're walking in now with this massive solution, and you need people that can kind of talk in that bigger sense. And that, quite frankly, is a very different skill set than just sort of the traditional SE. And then the other dimension is, how do you start to implement things like, or how do you help, for example, teams scale? And this is where you start to want to consider things like, centers of excellence, which generally get a very bad name, because the problem is people always think, oh God, we're throwing a lot of money and resources at this and we're not getting any value. But if you do that really well, if you create an organization that's an internal facing organization, which may include things like, teams that help you configure demos, right? Moving from some of that maybe higher impact work to lower impact work that SEs don't need to do. How can you scale that? How do you, ensure that you're rolling out best practices and doing knowledge exchange and webinars and all that kind of stuff? If you do that really well and create a sort of an organization that can help a larger SE organization share best practices, you have created something amazing. And those are often roles that are generally ignored until way too late, when the sales organization has become so big, or the SE organization has become so big, that it's almost stumbling over itself, right? And you need to reevaluate that. So as your organizations grow is really important. Again, I don't have a set, answer for you that says every SE organization should look like this, but I think you need to adapt as you grow and reevaluate what kinds of challenges are we facing. You can do that through surveys. You can talk to your customers. You can talk to your SEs, to your sales teams, and find out what kinds of challenges are we facing. And you'll see, well, we don't have industry experience. We don't have people who can walk into a retailer and talk retail. So those are the kinds of things, to do. Those are the concrete examples that I've seen, I think, in my experience, that, the biggest changes that have come along, sort of architects, industry specific roles, things along the lines of center of excellence, or people helping you with demos. Those are really important roles when the time is right.
Yeah, and I agree, and I think you're right. So it's not about it needs to look like this. So it's more about thinking about, hey, what is necessary within our business to be successful and to serve our customers in the best possible way. And even if you say, hey, we need to think about an architect role, the question is, okay, what kind of architect, right? Is it business architect? Is it technical architect? So got it. So yeah. If we say, that hiring part, so the key question was how to build that world-class pre-sales team. And basically we said, okay, we need to start with people, right? We need to hire some people. Otherwise we can't build a team. It brings me to a question. So what makes a world-class pre-sales team? And of course, we talked about people, right? So we definitely need people to have a world-class pre-sales team. Anything you would like to add to that people aspect?
Yeah, I think that, the other thing that's when you talk about, this is, I think, a hugely important point around this is, which is so often, by the way, not addressed, is the leadership component of this, which is, you can grow teams in SEs as many as you want. You can throw as many resources and bodies at the industry that you want. If you don't hire great leaders to help that business grow and develop those people, it isn't going to work. So that's where the leadership part is equally as important, and in some cases even more important than we're out there all the time as SEs looking for great SEs with deep technical skills or super storytelling skills or emotional intelligence and all this stuff. And amazingly enough, we screw up the manager hires way too often. We take people and stick them in the wrong positions. We take the most technical SE maybe, stick that person in a leadership role and think, oh, well, because this person has always been technical or close the biggest deals. They're therefore going to be successful in a manager. And if you mess that up, you will never scale an SE organization because you're essentially scaling a mistake, right? And it will backfire. So I think that leadership component is so critical when you're talking about the people. And when you create a dynamic in an organization, and I'm not saying I've done this, but you definitely sort of see it when it's working well and you see it when it's not working well. And I think if you make sure with rigor and sort of relentless focus on leadership, if you create great leaders and an environment where they are successful, that success scales. They will hire great people, and those people will hire great people. And that sort of culture of excellence that you build in will scale. That's where, for me, the leadership piece is equally as important, if not more, than just the profiles of the individuals that you're hiring. Yeah. And it's so often overlooked as, people don't focus on how to hire great leaders in an SE, in an SE community. Yeah. So important.
I think what you just elaborated on, basically people being, let's call it, over promoted, where they're great at what they do, but at some point they're promoted to an extent where they're not great anymore. Definitely in pre-sales, I've also seen that in the past. And I think this is also something that happens in sales and many other occupations, right? And certain pre-sales is not immune to that aspect of promotions.
Absolutely. And people are very good at the people who are ambitious and who generally, just because the people are knocking at your door saying, I want to get promoted to managers, doesn't mean they're the right ones. They're perhaps the ones who are best positioning themselves, or they're great at self-promotion, they're great at their brand, and they may be very good SEs. But sometimes in the SE communities, we are, quite frankly, there's a lot of introverts in our community. Like, we're a family of people that don't do a lot of, we don't blow our own trumpets a lot. We don't out there making a lot of noise. We tend to be a lot of people behind the scenes doing really good work. Sometimes those great leaders are there. And sometimes you have to find them and pluck them from obscurity and say, hey, you're actually the guy. I got 3 people over here telling me they want the job, but you're the guy I want, or the girl or whatever. But the idea is you look at it and say, it's not always the person that's knocking at your door who is, the right person to lead.
Yes.
So it's really important.
And I think there's one other aspect. You said leadership within pre-sales is crucial, but the nature of the role implies that we always work together with sales, right? Yeah. So I think there's an aspect of leadership in pre-sales needs to be strong. Leadership in sales needs to be strong, and they need to be fully aligned, because when you have that common approach, then you are set up for success.
That's absolutely correct. I have always been a firm believer in strong sales alignment. I think that's really critical. You don't want to have an organization that is completely out of sync with its sales organization. That being said, there are times where SEs know the SE team's best. Pre-sales people know our organization best, and we actually know what's best for us. So there are times where we may want to take a look and challenge ourselves from an organizational perspective and say, this is the sales organization we have, but what would really make sense here is maybe we pool together a couple of teams to support this region. And we can make a lot more sense of these resources and have it be more efficient if we do this. And sometimes sales leaders don't like that. They may look at it and say, oh, I want my SEs, right? I want my team. I want my dedicated resources, right? And sometimes we have to go back and challenge that and say, okay, understood, you're going to get them, but you're also sharing them, and here's why, right? And this is where the value selling comes into play, which is explaining to a sales leader why you're going to be sharing a pool of people. So it's so important that I think as leaders in the SE world, we push for what we ultimately feel is best, not because it's politically the right thing to do, not because it looks good on an org chart, but because we know that by doing this, it's best for the business. And sometimes maybe even better for our people, right? Because we need to be looking out for our people. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very exciting points. And maybe this can bring us to the next topic. The alignment between sales and pre-sales is certainly a criteria for success. But there's also a certain process potentially involved in that engagement, right? So, and maybe to ask the question in an open manner, between the work of sales and pre-sales working alongside each other, how much process do we really need versus how much flexibility do we need to really achieve our goals? And maybe I can make a bit more tangible to give also the audience a bit of an idea. So what I've seen in the past is that especially there's many SaaS companies are establishing presence in Europe, right? So often you find smaller teams that are landing here and trying to expand the business. And of course, this is not only sales, but also pre-sales that are coming into the market. And then at some point you have that threshold where you maybe have 4, 5, 6, 7 local pre-sales resources. And all of a sudden there's a need to firstly establish some local leadership, but then secondly, also to establish how are we actually going to work together going forward? Because in the very beginning, when it was only 5 people, yes, we were sitting in one room and we were just talking to each other constantly. But now that organization has grown and we need to become a bit more formalized to keep it efficient and have the same consistent quality output going forward. And so this is something I've seen multiple times actually in the past. And would be great to get your view on this.
Sure. So I'll give you, there's a really easy answer to this one, which is it depends, right? Of course, right? So again, it's very, very situational and really depends on your current situation. I've seen times where we sort of first started off with very small teams. We simply didn't have the need for, quite frankly, a particular process. We had a relatively small group of people. We had a relatively small group of SEs. We kind of figured it out, right? It was almost to a point where we didn't even have the critical mass really to put in a place that was too process driven. As the teams grew, particularly where what I noticed was as we were growing into new regions, right? Like you mentioned, right? You had new regions that were opening up. You had offices opening up in cities and countries where there was absolutely no process in place. The countries that were sort of adopting the other processes from either London or the US maybe were a lot more mature, and it was just sort of working. And as you started to open up into new areas, quite frankly, I generally have a very kind of macro management approach on this kind of stuff. That's my sort of more leadership philosophy. I generally try and give everyone as much freedom as they can and then tighten it as needed rather than tighten everything and then open it back up. Because I think it fosters more of a spirit of collaboration. I think people feel more empowered. I think they feel more like, we're able to solve the problems. But there are times where it is necessary. And I think when you get to a point where a couple of cases that come to mind where you have potentially very large variances in your ratio. So you have a large team of people supported by very few SEs. Maybe you have headcount that you're going to hire this year, but you may have I've been through a couple of acquisitions where suddenly the demand for a product was enormous and you had no choice but to put a sort of an SE request process in place because it was just so difficult to identify which opportunities were real. In that case, that can be a sort of an SE leader's dream come true, which is just we're going to sort of triage the requests. We need to have some process in place. That's something that I think can definitely help when you find that you've got either a massive need and very few resources, or there's simply no process that maybe has been in place in a local region. And then there are the other things, such as things like RFPs, right? I mean, this is sort of a big pain in our butt in the SE, community, but a necessary evil many times. That is an area where I am a very pro process. I am pro analyze the crap out of this thing and make sure it's worth it, because those hours generally supporting things like RFPs, I put into the bucket of low impact activity for SEs. I don't want to say people are wasting their time. It's just, quite frankly, there's time they could be spending on more impact activities. So if they're going to complete an RFP, I want to make damn sure that it's really worth it. So make sure you're spending the time going through a process of analyzing whether that makes sense. That's a case that I think is you should always be doing some analysis on that and always putting some process in place. So it's again, it really depends. But I think you need to look at the current situation in your team, always assess your team for feedback, speak to the SEs. Sometimes they'll be aware of problems. They may not necessarily be telling you. Data can tell you some stuff in this as well. You can take a look if your SEs are, logging data. if they're tracking their activities, you can tell, where they're spending their time potentially and where, you might need to optimize. And also burnout, right? I mean, that's also a thing you want to be finding out whether your SEs are doing too much work, are they burning out? And you want to find that out earlier rather than later, right? So those are all things that you want to be looking for when it comes to process. Generally, though, for me, I try to use process when it's necessary. I generally find SEs are fairly autonomous people. They work together as a team. You generally, when you have trust with a good team, you don't have to worry too much about that. But there are cases where you just, you need to put process in place.
Oh, fair enough. And I think in regards to the RFP example that you just gave, I think you're preaching to the choir. In fact, Jan and myself, we, for the German speaking listeners on the line, we have actually one episode dedicated to RFP where we very heavily also emphasize the need of process and exactly as you say, analyze the requirements, make sure that we truly believe we have a chance of winning here. I mean, I'm not going to go through all the spiel here. You can listen into that episode, dear listener, if you're curious. But yeah, pretty much a confirmation on that topic. So thank you for that one.
Yeah.
One other topic that came to mind, I mean, you were just talking about the SE request or resource request sort of process. Yeah. One thing that I had in my mind was also the general engagement between sales and pre-sales, right? Because, I mean, you mentioned the value selling aspect earlier, and I hope we can agree that, hey, Tim, next Tuesday, demo for XYZ, being the first time that I hear about this is exactly what you don't want to achieve. So absolutely, this engagement, I mean, you can call it a process. Maybe it's not a process, right? But sort of some agreement between these two parties on a best way forward to achieve good results.
Absolutely. I mean, that's sort of, that's something that I think is absolutely critical, and that's sort of it's sort of like your kind of your higher level, just SE basic engagement, right? And that's something that, quite frankly, it can take a long time. I think I've always been a champion of having some kind of engagement model, whether it's very, very loosely defined, whether it's very, very granular, again, depending on your situation. But, back to the topic that you mentioned earlier around the value selling, I just don't know how we do our jobs as effectively as SEs if we haven't sort of insisted on spending the time with customers to understand their challenges, right? This is the discovery, right? Then there's always a joke with Jon. It'll be like, oh, well, if you didn't know any discovery, there'll be no demo. You need to get to a point, and this is a hard thing to do, but you need to get to a point where everybody knows that that's the case, right? And you have to be relentless in that, you have to be relentless in that kind of qualification to a point where a sales team knows that's just not going to happen, right? And there'll always be cases where it does. And there'll always be like, oh, well, we've got, but the fact of the matter is like, that's part of our job as SC leaders. Sometimes we have to be the bad cops that come in and make a big stink. But the fact is you can do that. You can build that discipline in. And what happens over time is you'll see that it becomes sort of part of the natural execution model of a team. Salespeople will learn that as well. But for me, that's absolutely critical. I mean, I suppose we could probably do a whole session on just engagement model, right? The key steps of all that. But for me, yeah, I'm sure we could, but I think for me, the absolute sort of make or break, it's the old demo to win WIMP junction, right? This is one of those decisions where you say, do we go or no go? And the sales always says, well, we always do it in the end. And okay, maybe we do and we do it. The question is, how are we doing it? So it's like, okay, so let's do this. We'll do the RFP under the condition that we get an on-site discovery meeting or we get a half-day workshop with their key stakeholders. And that's very hard. That's harder to say no to. So then the sales guy's like, oh, well, okay, all right, we'll do that. We'll see if we can go, And that for me is all about building that into the execution model, right? And it's about not making it come across so much as it is process, as it is coming across as this is in our best interest, right? I think you guys know, right, that we're often seen as the Department of Sales Prevention, right? Sales guys come to us, we say, no, this deal sucks, like we don't want to do this. And they look at us and say the SCs are just being a pain in the ass and they're digging their heels in and they're not working with us. In actual fact, what we're trying to do is make sure we're working on the right stuff because we know where our time is best spent. So we have to fight for that. But we have to do some value selling to sales, right, to explain to them why this process is important. So, a lot of times I see SE leaders make the mistake of getting up in front of a sales team and they make a pitch and they say, here's my engagement model. Here are my rules, right? Rule number 1, if we don't do discovery, you won't get my resources. Rule number 2, no RFPs. Rule number 3. And the salespeople look at that, they're like, this sucks. Like, this is going to make my life hell. If we explain to them, though, why discovery is so important, if we explain to them that, 1 in 10 RFPs that we do that are blind, we lose. If we explain to them the value that if you engage SEs, your deal size increases by a 5x factor, these are all things that salespeople get. So it's value selling, but it's value selling with salespeople to say, this is why you want to engage in this way. Because a lot of them don't know that. They just don't understand really what the value is. And that doesn't mean they're stupid. It just means no one's really ever sat down and said, here's how you engage with the SE and the benefit that you get. So long answer to your short question, but you touched a nerve.
Very,
I think we're all familiar with the topic.
Yeah.
Very, very important. And so you said, Jon, it's potentially not just process. So I think it's also a lot of communication and even building that kind of mindset and culture, right? Because you are also for the hiring process, you would look for people who coming with that kind of mentality, right? So having the customer really in the focus, and before going there and doing something, trying to understand where these guys are coming from. Same discussion with the RFPs as you mentioned. And I mean, we all have faced these situations where it's like, as Tim said, right? So next week, Tuesday, let's do a demo, right? And I mean, even to that point, right? You could come up with an approach like, okay, I understand that you guys would like to show something, for example, whatever. But so let's sit down and let's discuss the scenario, right? Okay, you, Mr. Sales Guy, are covering the whatever retail industry, right? Let's sit down and really discuss what are their top challenges, how can we address them. So let's build a kind of, let's call it generic value story, right? We build you a demo based on that story, and we give it to you as a kind of mock-up or whatever. And then you are able to perform a value-based demonstration on your first meeting, right? But it's not just a demo, it's a story, because we created it together with that focus. What is the value the customer will get out of it, right? So go away from feature function, all that stuff. So even that kind of approach or asset, I believe, could add value and could improve that relationship between sales and pre-sales. And as you said, so the pre-sales resources are highly valuable. You don't want to have them for generic demos, right? But yeah, maybe there is a need within the sales organization if these people are willing to step up and go a little bit beyond the typical sales role. They would sit down with you and define that story and figuring out what the value for the retail industry is, and then it can make sense, right?
You're absolutely right. And I mean, absolutely. And I think that, one of the things that and this goes back, like to your point, I'm going back to the hiring. I envision one of the behavioral interview questions I ask a lot of people is exactly that one. I'm like, all right, so tell me what happens when sales guy comes in and says, I've just committed us to an 8:00 demo on Monday morning. You can see in people's reaction, how are they going to deal with this sort of from a relationship perspective? And this is where the emotional intelligence part of great SEs comes on board, because sometimes, SEs, we like to be very structured. We like to have our calendar organized. Everything has to be color coded. It has to be sorted alphabetically. Salespeople don't think like that. We're very linear. We're very structured. Salespeople are very non-linear, very unstructured. There's a lot of just sort of let's go, right? Head through a brick wall. So that's bound to clash, right? So what you need to do is you need to look also for those people that you're hiring into this excellent team and saying, how are these people going to react? Are you going to have somebody who is going to say, I'm going to take the higher road, right? I mean, I'm sure we've all been there. We've seen email chains, SE, salesperson, back and forth, escalation, SVP from sales gets involved. The whole, you're just watching this. It's a train wreck. And you're like, you want to know, you need to have also a skill set in your SEs. This is where, again, back to sort of Tim was saying about, the most technical person doesn't always win. It's like, it's dealing with those situations that can be really difficult. How do you work and move forward without having an escalation every time it gets stuff? And we all know salespeople can be very difficult people to work with. I mean, and we have to make that work somehow.
So there's one question, Jon, that I've been very curious to ask you. I mean, and I think to some extent you hinted at this when you answered a question earlier around that pre-sales resources or sales engineers are sometimes in love with their technology, but also you need to sort of have that entrepreneurial mindset. And one thing I was curious about, I mean, if you look back, and I mean, I can only talk around this from what I've read because I was too young by then, but if you look like 15 years back, maybe, or maybe even 20, when the cloud was not a topic yet, really, where on-premise software was sold, where it was often about, okay, how can we integrate this? How does it work? Can we customize it? Can we code? We want to make this application our own, where there was a very, let's call it bits and bytes heavy conversations ongoing that pre-sales would have. Now with the shift towards the cloud, where businesses are stepping away from having servers in their own basement, looking for business applications that can support their business in general, grow them, reduce risk, generate more revenue, these type of things. Is there a shift in the requirements that a pre-sales person needs to accommodate today as opposed to that time? And what challenges did that bring?
So it's a really good question. And I guess my inclination is to say, quite frankly, not really. I mean, I think that you're right. I think that maybe over time what's happened is as applications, even in my, I can remember sort of 20 years ago, I mean, there was so much coding at every level everywhere that it was just like, we've come so far in terms of architecture, infrastructure, how we build and design software today, that yes, you could potentially make the argument that maybe those technical skills are not as essential in an SE role as they used to be. But at the end of the day, here's where, I always exercise caution, is that there's this sort of saying that when the hard question in the room comes, everybody's head turns towards the SE, right? They all look over and say, okay, so what's the answer? There's always going to be a technical level of I think, knowledge that's going to be required. I think that is key. So when I'm hiring, I am always looking to see, is that at least that capability to learn there, right? I mean, whether you're thinking about, the old like COBOL programming or some of the stuff I used to do, the fact is if you could think logically, you could figure it out, right? And that skill set in human beings hasn't really changed. The capacity is still there to do it. It's just learning it today. So I think the most important thing is to be looking for the ability to learn what's required for the role. And then, to be able to say, how can you take that and use it to be very effective in the role? But, is it necessarily a change in skill set? I don't really know. I guess at the end of the day, I'm always looking for a good, solid foundation, or at the very least, the capacity for technical understanding. I have seen meetings where SEs potentially who you've hired who come in with zero technical knowledge, took a gamble, and meetings have crashed and burned. Like really, it gets to a point where the customer at this point no longer has the credibility of the resource because there's simply no way for them to answer the questions. That being said, I have always placed a very high focus on the sort of the soft skills and the emotional intelligence side of the equation. So for me, they are both really essential. Maybe there's been a little bit of a less of an emphasis on the technical stuff over the last few years. I mean, I could buy that, but don't let that go completely. I mean, you want to be careful that you don't find yourself in these meetings, because no matter what happens, whether it's your own product or someone else's, suddenly the integration topic may come up, or someone's going to have a deep question around security or whatever. And you don't want to have a team of people who can't have those conversations, or at least learn how to have those conversations. So I think that's really key. That mix, though, is still essential today for a successful SE, in my view.
Yeah, got it. Makes perfect sense.
I would also agree on that foundation you mentioned, right? So, I mean, for me, it's like you need to know your product. You need to know what your company is selling and how it works. And maybe the topic Tim mentioned is, okay, I need to know that to be successful in my job, but maybe the focus for me and in all these conversations with my customers is not necessarily the technology, but even more the business and the value we can bring to the customer, right? And at the end of the day, I think in that combination, it totally makes sense. But you don't walk into the room and say, "Oh, let me show you the 10 latest technology features of our software because they are so amazing," right?
Right. Exactly. And I mean, that is a really key part of the sort of the soft skills that I was referencing to. And it is hard. I mean, it's hard in the industry. Technical people, and I don't mean to diminish any of the technical people out there, but they're a dime a dozen. There's loads of technical people out in the industry. Finding somebody who has that technical ability and understanding and who can translate that into business value, that is a very rare skill. That's why it's hard to find great SEs. I mean, we do 9 jobs, right? We got to be able to do the technical stuff. We've got to get up and do great presentations. We've got to be able to value sell. We've got to be able to, deal with salespeople. There's all these elements of our job, which is really hard. But I do think that, to your point, Tim, we tend to fall in love with, technical skills. And we think that at the end of the day, that will save the day. And I think that we need to be really careful that, if you want to build those excellent teams and you really want to be doing what we always preach, which is selling value, then you need to make sure you're hiring people who actually get that. And sometimes you may have technical SEs that are like, I really don't understand why we need to value sell. I don't subscribe to this. I just want to get up and do my demo and show the customer this. That may work in certain areas of the industry or certain products. Who knows? It may just, the demo may just, there may be such a huge demand for your product. It just works. But I don't really believe that that's a sustainable, scalable way to grow a great team, in my view. So,
no. Yeah, definitely fair statement. So, we were coming from that point. What is needed to build that world-class pre-sales team? And I think we talked about people, we talked about soft skills, mentality, process, engagement, communication. So what else is important? What else do you need? I mean, I can imagine stuff like content and tools, but maybe you can add a little more light to that one.
Yeah, I mean, I think, interestingly, for me, I think, is always sharpening the axe, right? I mean, for me, this is one of the things that I see. I sometimes see even the best SE leaders will hire in a group of people, really top talent, maybe some people right out of university, maybe some great seasoned professionals, people from, and then they kind of just throw them into the business. And they get into this, the hamster wheel, and then nothing really ever changes for them. There's no development. There's no sort of, honing those skills, building feedback. These are things to me that are really critical. I mean, you can bring on a team, you can hire great people, but you have to work really hard, I think, as a leader to make sure that those people are developing, they're growing, they're staying sharp. They're learning the new skills, right? Just because you bring on some amazing talent from college, some, girl who's maybe top of her class, has a great skill set, doesn't necessarily mean that she's finished developing. You need to continue to work with her to develop those skills. Same thing with some, seasoned guy that you bring on board. This guy may not necessarily be, where he needs to be. So I think that's what you have to do. And I think a couple of things I think about along those lines are, taking your team out of the day-to-day, making sure they're coming out for sessions. And I used to run these things called demo sprints where you just get the team in a room for an hour and you do some activity that focuses on a certain skill, whether it's discovery or presentations or whatever, or getting your team off site and going for half a day to just sit and do something together that's focused on those skills. Sitting down with your, as a leader, with your team afterwards or with your individual SEs and giving feedback. This is the kind of stuff, in my view, that really builds in and helps develop a top performing team and keeps them performing. As well as also the other part, of course, is the training, right? Making sure people are taking time and relentlessly defending that time to learn, of letting SEs get out from the day to day and going to, develop those skills, whether it's technical skills or those, presentation skills. And you need to build that into your sort of your team. And the SEs need to know that's okay. They need to know that, and you as a leader lead by example by making sure that happens. You're helping them grow, helping them develop, and ultimately that's going to contribute to your business. But that's really key for me.
Yeah, great points. I mean, you specifically mentioned the aspect of giving each other feedback, and I mean,
yeah.
I've seen multiple flavors of this. I've been in sales presentations where afterwards I would just have a friendly conversation with my sales rep, and then we would go our ways. And then there would be others where we would dedicatedly take the time of maybe half an hour, or maybe even longer, depending on how comprehensive the presentation was. We would just talk around what happened and give each other feedback and say, okay, this is what went well, and this is what could have been better. So I think there's a lot of catching, in my perception again, there's a lot of catching up to do in establishing such healthy feedback culture. And then again, I mean, to your point, you said, okay, between pre-sales, we give each other feedback, but I think it's also between pre-sales and sales, right? I think we can all learn from each other.
Absolutely. But then, a lot of times, sure, you guys have heard this, right? You have those conversations with, you say, is it my job to enable salespeople? Like, do I have to be their coach? Shouldn't they know this stuff? And I have those conversations a lot, and I absolutely agree with you. I think, you know what, this is in our best interests. This shouldn't be our full-time job, and there's always going to be times where, it can be frustrating, and you may have the conversation 3 times. But ultimately, if the sales leadership is not taking the time to really coach and give that feedback, it is in our best interests to do that, because we are generally a trusted advisor of sales. So they a lot of times they're going to listen to us, and I think we have a lot of experience, and we know what's right. And it helps us. It helps us then, it helps us when sales is working better, it's better for us, right? So that's a really, really key point. I completely agree with you, Tim.
Yeah, and in most software sales organizations specifically, I mean, either pre-sales is either directly quota carrying or at least implicitly quota carrying because of team quotas. So even on that sense, there's an incentive, so to say, to take that conversation forward proactively from our perspective, so to say.
Absolutely. It's something to monitor, though. I mean, you do need to be careful. There are times where it can get out of control. I mean, clearly, if you've got a sales team where there's simply no coaching or leadership taken, then we all know those are red flags. That's something that obviously needs to be addressed. But I think a healthy percentage of time from SEs spent, especially because spent working with salespeople and coaching them is important, especially since we have that close bond. I think they trust us, and I think we're in a unique position to help them and help them do better. And I think we have a good sense of what's right and wrong during these sales cycles. So, it's a good thing for both of us.
Let me quickly add a maybe more specific question to it. So I completely agree on that training aspect, and definitely impossible to also train the basics, right? Like you said, get together, have some demo sprints, some tell loops, stuff like that. If we go one step back, I ask you about content and tools, right? So in respect of, maybe we call it assets, right? But so let's imagine we have the right people, the right processes in place, the culture is nice, engagement model is there. So if it comes to assets or content and tools, for me, it's a lot about efficiency, scalability, these kind of things. So is there stuff where I would say, okay, this is definitely essential to have it, or to at least think about it and put it in place at some point?
I mean, I don't necessarily have, 5 things that, and 5 assets, I guess, that every SE team either needs to have. I guess perhaps it's taking it up one more level, which is building in a culture of taking the time to, develop these kinds of things. Here's the worst case scenario, right? An SE sits down and says, you know what, I'm going to take time this weekend, which they shouldn't really be doing, but we all know this is when an SE does it. They'll sit down on Saturday and put together this amazing document on how to build a demo in 5 minutes using this specific tool, and sends it to his manager, sends it to the team, whatever, and nobody does anything with it, right? And it's like SE is like, holy crap, took the time to do that, best practice, amazing thing, and no one really cared. So what you need to do, I think, is if you start to build in a culture of embracing that kind of behavior, people will do it. I mean, I started to see this in one of the teams that sort of we started in a couple of years ago, where it was just about making sure there was recognition for that kind of stuff. And the more influential or you are in the organization, potentially the higher you are, the more sometimes your voice will carry, and people just need to see that happens. That's not always going to be the case, but I think it is a cultural thing. And I think that if you build that culture where people start to encourage that, and people feel that they're rewarded for that, and I don't just mean for the sake of doing content. I mean for the sake of actually helping out their fellow SE. Then I think that's really, really important. I generally am a big fan on a more sort of specific level. I mean, I think anything around, for example, anything that helps our teams scale. I mean, demo tools, teams that can help scale, documents that help SEs get up to speed faster. Ramp plans, for example, are really key. That's a really simple tool that you can put together where if you're in a sort of startup phase of a team, you got a lot of people coming on board, a documented ramp plan with links to all the stuff they need to know. You'd be amazed at what a waste of time it is if you've got 20 new SEs starting and every SE is figuring it out themselves. That's a huge help. I think particularly the sort of first 6 months of an SE's role, that stuff is really, really critical. And then quite frankly, I think, making sure that you've got somewhere documented your engagement model. I mean, this may not necessarily be a tool that you've got, but you want to have an engagement model that is sort of your SE leadership has sold to sales. They've got their buy-in, and SEs are aware of it. That is a key piece of content for me. Like, you want to have that in your hip pocket all the time and saying, this is the engagement model we use. Here's how we work as SEs. Here's why. Like, that to me is a critical asset. And I am often amazed by how many SE managers I talk to, and I'll be like, okay, walk me through sort of your engagement model. New sales guy walks in the room right now. What do you walk him through? And it's sort of like, like there's no answer. And I'm like, well, you need to have that. That's something every team needs to be aware of, and not just you, the leader, but your whole team needs to kind of know that and be able to explain that. Then I think otherwise, anytime you find yourself in a situation where you've got scarcity of resources, right? Or you've got how do you call it in English? An Engpass in German here. How do you call it? Like when you suddenly find you don't have enough resources. Bottleneck. There you go. And that's like if you want to sit down and think to yourself, what assets could we use here to help us, right? We're not going to get more headcount. How do we scale and make this problem better, right? You sit and brainstorm or run a design thinking session with your team on what assets. Assets should come from a need, right? Don't be creating assets just because, for the sake of creating assets, right? It should be something that that the SE team needs. So, yeah, long answer to your short question, but that's definitely a tough one. But, very important.
Yeah, that's my top skill, asking short questions and getting very long answers.
Yeah, my skill is answering with long answers.
I know.
Very synergetic approach then.
There you go.
Okie dokie. So, I mean, I would say we covered that slot, how to build that team quite well, and maybe getting there is already hard, right? But then how to stay world class?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that was sort of my point earlier. I think that's my big thing on how you stay world class is, I guess you need to make sure that you are continually, sharpening the axe. You need to make sure your people on your team are challenged. SEs, there's a lot of monotony in a role of SE. You can find that these people they can get very bored. And if you've hired really talented, smart people, they will get bored. I promise you. And you don't want them 6 months into the role coming to you and like, I hate this job. They need to feel they have that empowerment. They need to feel they have that development and they're growing in their careers. And I think that's key. I think that's how you maintain a world-class organization. And then you keep those hiring standards high. Never settle for mediocrity. Keep those standards high, bring in the right people. And then when they're in there, keep that, dimension of the team, and then move people into leadership roles who are going to keep that excellence in the team. That is key. It's different when you're going from 10 people and suddenly you grow to 100 people. The only way that's going to work is by making sure, again, you're promoting those right people. So that leadership part of it is critical.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Cool. Got it.
So I think the topics that we have covered so far were quite of a strategic nature, right? We talked about what makes a world-class team and how we then stay at that level. And maybe we can come to a bit more of an operational question regarding reporting lines and also how to measure actually the success of our pre-sales managers and individual resources. Now, maybe one opening question to get into that topic is, and I've seen certainly multiple flavors of it, where does pre-sales or where's pre-sales supposed to report into? I've seen pre-sales SVPs reporting into the chief revenue officer, maybe even sometimes to the CEO. Then there's a complete disconnect to the sales organization. And maybe sometimes you have pre-sales people directly reporting into sales leaders, which then sort of bears a certain conflict of interest at times, right? Due to the topics that we already discussed. So question to you, where do you see the ideal reporting line for a pre-sales team?
Oh my goodness, this is like the Gretchenfrage from Faust. This is like the really big one. So it's really interesting, right? This is where, unfortunately, far too often, I think the politics of organizations will come into play versus just common sense, right? And I'll be very clear. I have a view on this. It's not necessarily a set view. It doesn't mean it's right or wrong. It's Jon Upton's view. My general view is the higher up in the organization the SE is represented, the better. So if you take, for example, if you are within your organization and you have the ability of having a global representative for an SE organization that is reporting sort of right into your CEO or whatever, and assuming, of course, you have good leadership in that role, that is a great thing because it means you are being represented at the highest level of your organization. If, for example, which many companies do, you then break out into, for example, North America, South America, Europe, I believe that you still want to be reporting into your you want to have your SE organizations rolling up into your your EMEA, Europe, Asia, whatever leadership, and you want to have a seat at that sort of executive table. And I'll tell you why. The reason I believe that this is so important is because I think that the SEs need to have a voice. I think they need, because we are not very good, first of all, of having a voice. We're not very good at articulating our voice sometimes, and I don't mean this to say that we're not smart people. We are. We just don't always speak up. And I think that having that voice at that table is really, really critical. And I worry a lot when organizations start breaking down at too much of a granular level that the SEs lose that representation. And the other reason, too, is I do believe that SEs should be leading SEs. And I think that when you start to break apart an SE organization and have them report into at too local a level, maybe a local sales leader that doesn't have any experience or whatever managing SEs, I'm not necessarily sure they're always looking out for the interest of the SE. That's my thought on it. Again, this is Jon Upton's view. It can get very political when you start having these organizational discussions with people because people feel like, oh my God, someone's trying to break up my empire. It's, this is my country. I need to have all the resources here. So there's a lot to be said for things like local models. You can break certain teams up and have them operating together. Knowing the SEs and having been part of this community for so long, my view is generally the higher the better. So that's my 2 cents.
Great. So then maybe we come to a less complicated question, the less political question. Certainly a topic that also Jan and myself have been debating about for a long time. And that's around the KPIs that you would set for for a sales engineer, right? I mean, the most obvious one, we briefly touched on this earlier. Yes, quota carrying. We just give them some sort of revenue target. And once they work on opportunities and those opportunities become closed, they get attainment towards that. I think that's a no-brainer. Yeah. And I think what other KPIs would you believe do really make sense potentially also to facilitate team motivation, to facilitate constant growth of these pre-sales resources? As you mentioned, that growth and constant development is such an important factor. Do you have any ideas that you want to share with us in that regard?
Yeah, I suppose before we talk about specifics, I think the most important thing, and this goes in sort of alignment with my sort of leadership philosophy and the way I see the world is, KPIs are good, and you should have KPIs. You should know sort of how your team is performing. But I think it's really key to make sure at the most fundamental level, and it's the same thing I'll say to a customer. If they ask me, oh, we want to charge ahead with this project, and they'll say, and I'll say, well, how are you going to know that you've been successful? Like, make sure that when you're sitting down and thinking through this, make sure that you understand what it is you're looking for and how this is going to tie back to, ultimately the success of your team. And that is really important because I see a lot of, you see a lot of Excel managers, right? People who just sort of sit there, and I sometimes think they're tracking KPIs for the sake of tracking KPIs. And I'm not sure what they are. I don't know which KPIs they are. I don't even know why they're tracking them. There needs to be a reason behind it, right? I'll give you a great example is something that for me is always an interest. And this was a great one we've used, in many teams over the years is taking a look at, for example, things like the amount of customer facing time versus, non-customer internal time, more as a percentage necessarily than necessarily sort of, the specific hours, or the time spent doing high impact versus low impact activities. And if you sit and think for your team, I don't have the set list for everybody's team in the world, but, I go through this exercise where you sort of break all the activities of an SE, sort of like a Venn diagram into two circles, high impact and low impact. Where do you want SEs to be spending their time? And then, I'm in support of SEs tracking their time. It's as long as they understand why they're doing it, right? For me, that's really key. And if they understand that by tracking time, you're going to be saving yourself doing RFPs, or you're going to increase your overall team productivity, or you're going to get additional resources, then that's all good. But understanding where your team is spending time and which buckets they're working in can help you tremendously to understand where you might be having problems, or why you're having burnout, or maybe your win rates aren't as where they should be if the overall sales organization isn't performing. So I think at the most important level, it's really important to think about what exactly are the KPIs that why, how the KPIs that you're going to use are going to support that overall strategy. And then think about, okay, which ones am I tracking? And then the other thing to think about is which ones am I using and for what purpose? And there's also the internal PR aspect of this, which is like, there are times where you may need to go and ask for headcount. We always assume everyone knows the value of our organization, but if you go to the CFO and say, I need 10 more heads, and she says, well, you don't have budget for them. And you just say, well, I need heads because we're a great SC organization. That might not fly. So you might need to be able to explain through the CFO, here's the value that we bring to your organization, and let me articulate that. And if you can't back that up from a data-driven perspective and explain, here's the impact we're having on your business, here's the, how we increase your overall deal size, here's how we, increase the overall win rate, then it's going to be very difficult to be making those kinds of asks. So I think unless you just have a very person who's very, very emotional and just like believes in you, and with CFOs, I don't know, it's generally not the case. They're data driven. They need to look at the stuff from a pragmatic perspective. So I think overall, I don't have a silver bullet. I don't have like, here's your list of 10 KPIs that you have to track. I think most importantly is you should sit down and think, which direction are we going with this team? What are we trying to achieve? Obviously we're trying to, make more money, right? But every team is a little bit different, and you need to sit down and think to yourself, okay, what do I want to measure and how? And then I think the other thing too is make sure that you are, you want to be careful that you don't send a message to your teams. This is also, again, part of my, philosophical view is that you're not micromanaging the team. There's that concern that if there are too many KPIs, that it's just a KPI game. And SEs generally don't respond too well to that. So I think you want to make sure the KPIs you pick are supporting your strategy and that the SEs understand why these KPIs are important. And if they subscribe to that, then, they're willing to sort of say, okay, I get this. And also, make sure that they see, why you're doing it. So I think that's the most important element around KPIs, to be perfectly honest with you.
Yeah, fair point. I mean, I can remember Jan and myself having discussions around, particularly the example that you gave around tracking time spent on certain opportunities that you worked on.
Yeah.
And I think every pre-sales individual pre-sales person will sort of start rolling their eyes when the manager says, "Okay, I want you to track this time spent on opportunity," because most of the time it's it's really painful exercise. That being said, of course, at least I have seen, which is great, is that there's tools, for example, that allow you to synchronize CRM with your calendar, which makes it then less painful and less manual. That can assist with this process. But certainly what you said, which was also your overall conclusion here, is to, when you make the people understand why they're doing it, it's not about supervision, right? It's about being able actually to do things in your favor. If you are constantly stretched thin in time, then maybe we do need the resources, but we also need to argue that point in front of someone who can make the decision, okay, do we get extra headcount or not? So
yeah. And I think, I think that the biggest mistake I think SE leaders make around KPIs is they don't communicate to their teams why they are using them. SEs, I think, are generally very pragmatic people. I think if you sit down with them and say, guys, I would like to explain to you, and I'd like to explain to you why we're doing this. I'd like to explain to you, first of all, the KPIs we are using. Sometimes, honestly, there may be KPIs that just come down from the top, and that's the reality. There may be KPIs that, a sales leader or a global SE leader or EMEA CS leader, I don't know, wants to see, and you may just have to do that. It's always good to challenge and ask why, and be able to explain to your team why leadership is tracking this. I think if your leadership is struggling to answer that question, that's a little bit of a bigger problem that you want to look at, because it's like, why are you tracking a KPI if nobody knows what the hell we're tracking it for? But that communication is key. If you can get some buy-in on it, you'll find the SEs are more likely to say, okay, I get it. I see why they're doing it. It's a bit of an admin nightmare and I don't really want to do it, but I know this is helping our team and helping our business. So therefore, hey, I'm along with it. And then the other dimension is these sort of KPIs, MBOs and things like that I think every SE team struggles with, which is making sure that these are not just bogus, people creating content and assets and slide decks and doing WebExes for the sake of it. I think my guidance there is it's okay to have those. Just make sure that people understand that, make sure the stuff is being done for the right reason. And again, that people understand, how this is going to help the larger team, right? You don't want people sitting creating decks and then no one ever hears about them. They go into some file someplace and no one ever hears it, because that's lost time. That's really, really key. But I think that communication, and then sometimes walking your team through maybe a deck that you presented to the executive, team, and says, by the way, guys, here are the KPIs. Here's how I reflect. Here's how I sell the team upwards. So they see that and say, now I get why Jon is doing this, and I see that my leader's doing this because they're trying to get some headcount for me. And by tracking this, I'm helping myself longer term by making sure we have a business case for more headcount. It's that why, right? It's kind of the so what. It's back to the value selling.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree that the overall purpose of things we do in our daily lives is very important for the individual to understand, to leverage that motivation and understanding makes full sense.
Yeah.
So maybe as a last topic for our conversation here,
Sure.
Maybe it's a bit of a personal one, because you've been elaborating on your path from a sales engineer towards the higher levels of pre-sales leadership. And what certainly would be very interesting to me to understand, what did it take to get there? How did you get recognized that you would be suitable for a leadership position? And and how can we develop our careers working in pre-sales if we have ambitions to do that?
Wow. So good one. And I think, it is, it's kind of like, I think that, again, it's you're probably noticing a recurring theme here. I think the most important thing is always to stop and ask yourself, which direction am I moving in, and am I moving in a direction I want to go? What is it that I want to achieve? Right. I mean, sometimes there's this pressure to say, oh, I have to become a manager, right? That has to be my next step. If I'm not, someone's going to think I'm a failure, or, and I think it's so important to make sure that you're honest to yourself and say, this is genuinely what I want to do. And it is okay to say, quite frankly, I don't want to become a manager, or maybe I was a manager and I don't want to do this anymore. So I think that's really key. You have to, only you can answer that. So I always encourage people to sit back and think, okay, what do you want to do? For me, I started to get sort of hugely motivated a couple of years ago, back when I was at SAP, around, working with some people who I saw as great leaders. And I said, you know what? I want to do this. I want to start to hopefully grow and develop some teams. It's like, I think I bring enough to the table. And that sort of kicked me off in a point where I said, I think I can take this step and do it. And never look back. I think I've realized that, whether I do it, a good job or not, I don't know. But I definitely do it out of passion. I definitely do it because I love the job. I love the people development. I love being with customers. And I love sort of watching teams grow and develop, including both SEs as well as leaders. So for me, that's always been a very, personal inspiration. And then I think, how do you do it? I mean, I don't have I wish I had a silver bullet for you, but I do think that, I've had a lot of mentoring conversations over the last years, and a lot of people come to me, and I end up having a lot of brand building conversations with people. And I think particularly in the SE community, like I referred to earlier, we have a lot of introverts. We have a lot of people who just do amazing work. They work really hard, and they kind of sit back and think, I'll get promoted and move up because of my hard work. And I do think there's an element that we have to step out of our sort of, our more introverted SE side and say, I'm going to kind of own this career step. I'm going to do what it takes to make sure people understand that I have the skills for this job. I'm going to set up a call with my manager and maybe my N+1 and walk them through my career plan. By the way, I think a career plan is a great thing to have for anybody. If you haven't sat down and sort of put your career down on paper, and it's something you can walk somebody through, that makes it very tangible, for your manager, for your sort of your management chain. That's a good way to sort of, show people that you're really interested. And then that sort of willing to step up and leading by example, I think, has been something that I value in leaders who I hire, and something I've always tried to do, which is to prove to the people around you that you have these skills, and that you're willing to kind of step up and take on a new challenge, or jump up and take ownership of something. And a lot of times with SEs, we're really busy. We don't always want to do that. And I think that's really important. I think that if I look back and think to myself, having put my hand up, or just being very proactive about that career management level, that career management aspect, or making sure that I am making sure people know what I'm doing, right? Making sure both my sales leaders I support, my people above me, as well as my team, all sort of know what I'm doing and maybe the value I'm bringing. And there's a little bit of self-promotion sometimes in that, and that's difficult for a lot of people. But I think those are some of the things that I think are really important in terms of career development. And again, I don't want to sit here and say I've done this all right. I think we all make mistakes along the way, but I do think that's an important element to sort of, making sure that you're moving forward in your career, assuming again that it's what you want to do.
Got it. So I guess I could sum that up as take leadership, even though maybe you're not mandated by title to do that, but as you put it, lead by example. Sort of to be recognized. Okay, this could be someone who is suitable for such a position, and then keep at it at that point.
Yeah, I mean, you need to. I think if you think about the next career step, you always want to be showing people around you that you're ready for it. I think a lot of times, also depending on your company culture and how how promotions are dealt with, I think you need to, at some point, you're going to be able to need to prove to people that you can do the job. And the easiest way to do that is to be able to point to the past and say, here's what I've already done. And sometimes that's difficult, right? Putting your hand up for something that you're, not convinced you're doing, or maybe it's a little bit, you see it as not your job, but look, it's a step you're taking, and be willing to sort of do that, be willing to take that challenge, but then also be willing to tell someone about it. Be willing to take the time, and you can brag about it. Make a little noise about it. Make sure people know. And that, I think, is the biggest mistake. SEs do great work, and we generally are not very good at talking about our successes and telling people about it. So.
No. And I think, Jon, also, be honest with yourself, right? So reflect a little bit for yourself. As you said, what have you done in the past, and what is it really what you want? And figuring out what is necessary to get there. And I think, as you said, so if you are able to step into a leading position, even without the title, then you can really prove it for yourself and with your colleagues and with your current manager that you are able to do it, right? So I think you need to invest a little bit upfront, and it's not like, okay, hey, promote me to manager and then I will do all that stuff. So I think you need to show it beforehand. And I think you're also right. So for some people, I think it's kind of natural that they are able to lead without authority, right? Because people are following them. And I think that's a key term for me. So as a leader, you need followers, right? Otherwise, who you would like to lead. So agreed with you. And for me, another very interesting aspect is from an organization point of view. As you said at the very beginning, I think organizations need to think about these career concepts they put in place, because maybe it's not the best move for whatever the best technical SE to step up as a manager, right? So you need to make sure that there are possibilities to grow or to expand your position or your knowledge or whatever. And the answer is not, it needs to be manager. No, there are other opportunities, right? You can be architect, you can dive into a specific industry or whatever it will be. Because I have also seen amazing people being promoted into a manager role, and 3 months later they have been gone, right?
I just mean it's a very good point. I mean, I think that you need to think about that when you're developing your organization and growing, that, you're going to hire 10 people and maybe one of those in a year's time will be a manager, and not all of them. So that's the question of making sure that you think about that. What does your organizational career plan look like for SEs? I'm generally not a fan of building organizations around people. You want to build it around the business and the customers, and then make sure that you do think about that. But I mean, that is an important point. But it is also part of the natural evolution of a business. I mean, when you hire great talent, you're going to have people you're going to have 4 people going for a manager job, and you're going to have some disappointed people. It's how you deal with those people that's really critical. And make sure you don't, you either manage expectations, you're able to, talk to them about why. But I think that those career opportunities are super critical. And I think that, and I think it's really important. And I think that's something to be considering as you're building your organization. Absolutely.
Right. So I think we learned a lot about how to build world-class pre-sales team, how to stay there. And I could imagine that there are some people outside who would also like to talk to you. So what is the best way to get in touch? I would assume maybe LinkedIn, right? But
absolutely, I think that's good. I don't actually have specific contact details yet for the new role, but LinkedIn is always a safe bet. Absolutely.
Okay. I mean, I have your phone number, so maybe we should put that one into the show notes.
I don't mind. That's fine. I'm all good. No one ever calls me anyway, so I'm happy.
All right,
cool.
I think we will also put the one book you mentioned, The First 90 Days, right? We'll put that in the show notes. You quoted another book. One. You said Sharpen the Axe, right? Which again reminds me of Stephen Covey and the 7 Habits. We can put that also down in the show notes. And
absolutely.
And maybe to the audience, since we're concluding now this conversation, firstly, many thanks for staying with us for the time. We hope you learned a lot and could take something away from this. And a little ask from our side. This was, again, our first conversation we had in English. We would love to get your feedback on this. Should we do this more often? Would you be keen to listen into this type of content more often in English? So give us some pointers. And of course, as usual, do follow us on LinkedIn. This is where we post the majority of our content, not only episodes, but also other useful stuff. And with that being said, dear Jon, this was a great conversation. Many thanks for making yourself available. And again, it was great having you on the show. And
it was a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Guys, so Mr. Brömer, I have one more thing. So very, 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 I would say special and personal piece, right? So I would say, for all the guys who doesn't know, a couple of years back, Mr. Upton hired me, right? So maybe you remember that.
Well, we all make mistakes.
Yeah, being at Salesforce, and so that was my kind of start into the real world of pre-sales, right? My first job as at an American company and exploring that new field, and I still remember our first conversation, right? Because back in time, my English was terrible, right? And we started our conversation, and you, as a native American, you started talking in English to me, and I was like, "What the fuck," right? So we ended up talking a little bit in German, and I remember you said, "So I have seen two different people, right? So the English-speaking guy and the German-speaking guy." But finally, you said, "Okay, I have seen the right guy for the team, and I'm willing to invest into you," right? And so that's my chance now to say again, thank you to you for giving me that opportunity. And I think it completely reflects what you told us for the last, what is it, already 1.5 hours, I guess. When it comes to hiring people and believe in their strengths and seeing the ability to develop to a certain point, right? So I'm still thankful that you did that, and that you saw that kind of pre-sales person in me, because without that I wouldn't have had the chance to step up to the place where I am. So big thank you to you, Mr. Upton, and of course thank you for taking the time and doing that podcast episode with us.
Absolutely, it's a pleasure. And I guess on the last note, you're right. I mean, I think hiring for potential is a huge thing, and I think it's a difficult thing that a lot of managers struggle with. Is you a lot of people hire the person sitting in front of you. And you want to hiring people, I'm trying to look 10 years down the line and thinking, who's the person in front of me and where are they going to be 10 years from now? That's hard. I think a lot of people struggle with things like behavioral interviewing and all that stuff. But honestly, yeah, it's what I did with you. You sit down and you see somebody in front of you, and you're like, wow, here's some talent. So absolutely, it was a pleasure, guys. Always happy to do that. And thank you very much for the great facilitation. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. And yeah, thanks to the audience. Thanks for listening. As Tim said, hopefully you guys have some feedback, some inspiration for us. And in that sense, have a great day. Thank you and goodbye.